your thoughts about the efficiency of how we're using the capital out there for smallholder farmers, because I know Bangona works very closely with smallholder farmers.
We do, and I think in fairness to the current administration, I think there has been a concerted effort to try to increase the amount of capital out there. I think the reality is that there's still opportunity to improve that. I think there's opportunity to try to learn from some of the other countries and other organizations that have been very effective at deploying capital and getting returns for that in terms of higher repayment rates and so on and so forth.
Yes.
But I think one of the key challenges I think that you see is historically, Nigerian government has focused on all their efforts on trying to reduce the price of particularly fertilizer in the Nigerian markets. And they do that through direct subsidy programs. Now, credit to the current administration, they've actually moved away from those direct subsidy programs, which were highly inefficient and had significant leakages. However, their initiatives that they have, be it that they are working more closely to revive local blending facilities and try to get products out there, it's still a focused effort on trying to reduce the price of the product. When in reality, what we need to focus on is how do we increase the purchasing power of the Nigerian farmers so they can access these products.
All right, so let's look further ahead. What could change? What could be a game changer in terms of getting that capital to the farmers in Nigeria? What can we learn from other markets in terms of bringing that capital to the farmer?
Well, I think it's really around thinking about how you're able to crowd in lots of parties to be effectively to distribute that capital and be able to get repayments on those loans. Right. And I think if you learn from places like Brazil, where they've been very focused on helping to provide clarity around types of contracts, ensuring that lenders have recourse in the event of default, so on and so forth, strengthening some of the small claims courts in rural communities, things like that give confidence to folks to be able to go in and deploy capital. That's one piece, but I think a couple very important areas I think this administration, really, to be fair, most of the administrators have not focused on is really around ensuring that the Nigerian farmer has the best available technology to compete with farmers around the world. And when I talk about
when you say technology, what do you mean?
I mean about seed.
Right.
Right. And
so the research that has to go into making sure that the seed is right for Nigerian soil and all of that. Is that what you mean?
Well, there's two pieces, right? The research, existing research, there is existing research. However, the Nigerian government doesn't make it very easy for leading seed companies around the world that have a lot of this technology already to be able to come into the country and commercialize that technology and get that technology into the hands of the farmer. Because the reality is, if you're a farmer and you're dealing with seed that was developed in 1998, think about it, if your laptop was from 1998, right? You'd just be starting with a disadvantage. When the reality is you could get access to technology that could give you a yield potential that is 50%, sometimes up to 100% better than what you're doing now.
Right. Very important point you're making here. But clearly there's an ecosystem here that needs to be brought together. You've identified capital, clearly, for the farmer as something that we certainly need to strengthen. I'm just wondering what will be the next step for whoever wins this next election, because we know this government has made the point that agriculture is a big part of their focus. We've seen some progress, but clearly not enough. How can we get that ecosystem really working again?
Well, once again, I think the reality is there are examples of countries that have done that. One of my personal favorite examples of this is Thailand, right? And Thailand's reality, from an agroecological standpoint, is very similar to Nigeria. The reality is, in 1980, Nigeria and Thailand had very similar per capita GDP. Now Thailand has 4x more than Nigeria. What did they do? Well, they focused on first ensuring that they increased the on-farm productivity of their small farmers by ensuring they had access to the best available seed anywhere in the world. They had access to good quality fertilizer, and they had access to loans to purchase that. Now, the other thing that they did is they recognized that their FX policy wasn't favorable to becoming an exporter, right? So they actually devalued their currency, right? Which made their farmers more competitive with the rest of the world, and they were able to dramatically grow their industry. Today, Thailand exports $35 billion in agricultural produce. 40% of their workforce still work in agriculture on farms, typically about 3 hectares. And they have one of the world's lowest unemployment rates, at less than 1%.
Right. I know a lot of those products were coming into Nigeria, probably still coming in here. But final point will be on the finance ecosystem. I do get the sense that the type of financing structure that you're talking about is not going to be provided by the bank. So do you see an opportunity for, even if the central bank were to back certain types of financiers, to create a finance ecosystem for Nigeria's agri-space?
Well, it's a very good point. And once again, I think it's important to learn from others, right? If you look at other key markets, what they tend to have is not so much government institutions that are financing, but these are still private sector institutions, but in a sense supported by government. And they have
they're not banks, right?
They're dedicated agricultural lending institutions. So these are dedicated.
Not your typical commercial bank.
Typical commercial bank. Dedicated agricultural lending institutions. And the reality, there will always be a place for commercial banks. I think if you look at the U.S. today, roughly about 50% of the agriculture space is financed by these dedicated agricultural lending institutions, but the other 50% is still financed by traditional commercial banks. But what those dedicated agricultural lending institutions creates that ecosystem that you're talking about to ensure that this sector, in good times and in bad times, continues to get that capital. And every year, that sector gets $200 billion a year just from these dedicated agricultural lending institutions.
We certainly look forward to progress in this area simply because of the sheer number of people that agriculture employs in Nigeria. And someone made a very interesting point that while agriculture is employing so many people, it's not necessarily, the way it's working in Nigeria does not necessarily mean that they are wealthy. It still keeps them in poverty. So that cycle needs to change.
Well, I think one very important last point, though, on your ecosystem piece is right now the Nigerian government is very focused on lending to the sector off its own balance sheet. The reality is that can only go so far. The Nigerian government has a lot of money, but what they need to focus on is how can they work with parties to catalyze in more funding, which is what the U.S. government did very effectively by providing implied guarantees for folks to go and raise bonds to finance the sector.
Thanks so much, Kola, for coming in and sharing some useful insights into Nigeria's agriculture space.